Welcome to Silent Screams, where the darkness speaks and the shadows come alive. Tonight, we delve into a chilling tale, one that could very well change the way you see the world around you. Turn off the lights, let the silence settle, and prepare yourself for a story that will creep under your skin and linger long after the final word is spoken. It began with a man named David. He wasn't particularly brave, nor was he overly cautious. Just an average man with a penchant for hiking alone, away from the noise of the city. He had a routine every weekend. He would pick a trail, lace up his boots, and head into the wilderness. The forest became his sanctuary, a place to clear his mind and breathe. But this weekend was different. The sun was setting earlier than usual, casting long, spindly shadows across the trail. David felt it first in his gut, a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. The air was colder than it should have been for late spring, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed muted. It was as if the world around him had been wrapped in a suffocating blanket of silence. Still, he pressed on, convincing himself it was nothing more than fatigue. About a mile into the trail, he noticed something peculiar. A small, weathered signpost, its paint peeling, stood crookedly by the path. The words etched into the wood were barely legible, but he could make out enough. No entry after sunset. He paused, staring at the sign. It wasn't there the last time he'd taken this route. David chuckled nervously, brushing it off as some local attempt at scaring off trespassers. He checked his watch. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, and the golden hour had given way to an eerie twilight. He considered turning back but decided against it. He'd been on this trail dozens of times before. What could possibly go wrong? The forest seemed darker now, as if the trees were conspiring to block out the last remnants of daylight. The crunch of his boots on the dirt path sounded unnaturally loud, and with every step, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. David could feel it now, an invisible weight pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. Then, he saw it. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a pale figure standing motionless between the trees. He blinked, and it was gone. His heart raced as he quickened his pace, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows. He told himself it was nothing, perhaps an animal or a reflection. But deep down, he knew better. A low, guttural sound echoed from somewhere behind him. It wasn't a growl, nor was it human. It was something unnatural. David froze, his breath hitching in his throat. Slowly, he turned, his eyes scanning the darkened trail. Nothing. Just the empty path stretching into the gloom. He laughed uneasily, the sound brittle in the oppressive silence. Get a grip, he muttered to himself, but his voice sounded foreign, hollow. He started walking again, faster this time, his footsteps hurried and uneven. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakable. Voices, low and overlapping, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, endless and shifting, playing tricks on his mind. His flashlight flickered, and his heart leapt into his throat. No, 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 he whispered, smacking the side of the device. The light sputtered back to life, but the beam was weaker now, casting long, trembling shadows on the ground. He cursed under his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he hurried along the path, he noticed something strange. The trail markers, bright red ribbons tied to tree branches, were missing. He stopped, his chest heaving, as he tried to orient himself. Panic began to set in as he realized he was lost. The forest, once familiar and welcoming, now felt alien, hostile. A sudden, bone-chilling scream tore through the silence, freezing him in place. It was close, too close, and it didn't sound human. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the scream faded into a guttural, choking noise. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. And then, he saw her. A woman, pale and ethereal, standing just off the trail. Her face was obscured by a curtain of dark, matted hair, and her dress, tattered and stained, clung to her emaciated frame. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he could feel her gaze, heavy and malevolent, piercing through him. "Hello?" His voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. She tilted her head ever so slightly, as if considering him. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, she pointed a bony finger down the trail. David's mouth went dry as he took a hesitant step backward. She didn't follow, didn't speak. She just stood there, pointing. He turned and ran, his heart hammering in his chest. The forest blurred around him as he stumbled over roots and rocks, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The whispers were louder now, surrounding him, mocking him. He thought he heard his name, faint and distorted, but he didn't dare look back. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell, tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain shot through his body as he landed hard on the rocky ground. His flashlight rolled away, its beam casting eerie patterns on the trees above. Groaning, he tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ankle stopped him. As he reached for his flashlight, something cold and slimy brushed against his hand. He yelped, jerking back, and the beam of light illuminated the source. A hand, pale and clawed, reaching out from the shadows. His scream echoed through the forest as the whispers turned into laughter, low and guttural, echoing all around him. And that's when he realized he wasn't alone anymore. David lay frozen on the forest floor, his breathing shallow and erratic. The pale, clawed hand retreated into the shadows, leaving behind an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. His flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The laughter, the guttural, mocking laughter, still echoed around him, each note stabbing at his sanity. He struggled to pull himself up, wincing as pain shot through his ankle. It was swollen, and every attempt to move it sent sharp jolts of agony up his leg. Panic set in as the realization hit him. He was injured, alone, and surrounded by something that defied logic. The forest felt alive now, watching, waiting. The trees seemed to twist and lean closer, their gnarled branches resembling skeletal fingers. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. David's flashlight sputtered again, plunging him into near total darkness before flaring back to life. And then he saw it. A figure, hunched and distorted, crawling toward him from the underbrush. Its movements were erratic, jerking like a marionette controlled by unsteady hands. The figure's face was wrong, features twisted and stretched, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. It made no sound as it dragged itself closer, its limbs contorting unnaturally. David's instincts screamed at him to run, but his injured ankle rendered him helpless. Desperate, he reached for the nearest object, a large stick, and swung it wildly, barely grazing the figure. It paused, tilting its head like a curious animal, before letting out a low, guttural growl. The sound reverberated through the forest, sending a flock of unseen birds scattering into the night sky. Using every ounce of strength he had, David dragged himself backward, his hands scraping against the rough ground. The figure advanced slowly, its glowing eyes locked on him. Just as it reached the edge of the flashlight's beam, it stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again, save for David's ragged breaths. Then, without warning, the figure reared back and let out an ear-piercing shriek. The sound was so loud, so primal, that it felt like the forest itself was screaming. David clamped his hands over his ears, but it did little to muffle the noise. He could feel it vibrating in his skull, threatening to tear his mind apart. The shriek abruptly stopped, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive silence. When David looked up, the figure was gone. The forest seemed still again, but he knew better than to trust the calm. Every instinct told him that whatever had just happened was far from over. Summoning his courage, David retrieved his flashlight and scanned his surroundings. The beam landed on a narrow trail, one he didn't remember seeing before. It was overgrown, with roots snaking across the path and moss clinging to the rocks. But something about it called to him, a strange pull that he couldn't explain. With no other options, he began crawling toward the trail. The pain in his ankle was excruciating, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. The forest seemed to shift around him, the trees bending and twisting as if to guide or trap him. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, like a broken radio signal. David tried to block them out, focusing on the path ahead. It felt like hours had passed when he finally reached a clearing. The sight before him stopped him cold. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, its surface covered in strange, glowing symbols. The air around it was colder, heavy with an energy that made his skin crawl. Wisps of mist swirled around the base of the well, glowing faintly in the dim light. David's flashlight flickered, but even in the moments of darkness, the well seemed to radiate an otherworldly glow. As he stared, a sense of déjà vu washed over him. He didn't know why, but the well felt familiar, as if he'd seen it in a dream or a nightmare. He inched closer, his curiosity battling with his fear. The symbols on the stones pulsed faintly, almost as if they were alive. Then, he heard it again. The whispers. But this time, they were louder, clearer. They were calling his name. David. He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from the well. He took another step closer, unable to resist the pull. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they became a cacophony of voices, all calling out to him. David, help us. He peered over the edge of the well, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The darkness inside seemed bottomless, an abyss that swallowed the light. But as he stared, something moved. At first, it was just a ripple, like disturbed water. Then, shapes began to emerge, faces, twisted and contorted, their mouths open in silent screams. David stumbled back, his heart racing. The faces grew clearer, pressing against the darkness as if trying to escape. Their eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull him in. One of the faces looked familiar, too familiar. It was his own. The sight was too much. David turned and tried to crawl away, but the whispers turned into screams, deafening and relentless. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and a low, rumbling sound came from the well. He risked a glance back and saw something rising from the darkness, a figure, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. The air grew colder, and David's breath came out in ragged puffs of mist. The figure moved with unnatural fluidity, stepping out of the well as if gravity didn't apply. It turned toward him, and though it had no eyes, he could feel its gaze, piercing and unrelenting. David's body refused to move. He was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of the faceless figure. It raised one of its impossibly long arms, pointing directly at him. The ground beneath him cracked, and the earth seemed to shift, dragging him closer to the well. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, this isn't real." But it was. The forest, the whispers, the figure, all of it was horrifyingly, undeniably real. The figure began to glide toward him, its movements smooth and deliberate. As it approached, the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, filling his mind with 1,000 incoherent voices. Just as the figure reached him, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging David into complete darkness. The last thing he heard was his own scream, swallowed by the void.